Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it's a privilege for me to rise today and debate on Bill C-311. And in many ways, it's an honour as a parliamentarian, but also as a veteran, Madam Speaker, and as a former Minister of Veterans Affairs. In fact, in many ways, this speech will have elements of my speech in this place in 2014, Madam Speaker, because this issue keeps coming back to the floor of the House of Commons. And I think any time we debate remembrance of those who have served our country, it's worthy of debate in this House, probably the most important debates we can have. So I thank the member from West Nova for bringing this modest contribution. Certainly his bill would really add a word, creating a legal holiday with respect to November 11th. And it builds in part on the bill in the last Parliament, Bill C-597, which I spoke on, brought by MP Dan Harris from the New Democratic Party, then member for Scarborough Southwest, who had a slightly more substantive bill with respect to this, Madam Speaker, which was not successful. He would have also had provisions with respect to the flag. But I can say this, there's been several parliaments that have had this debate. Several members have mentioned that really the statutory holiday elements of this are provincial. In 1982, Premier Bill Davis removed the statutory element for Remembrance Day in Ontario. I'm an Ontario MP. I certainly know that schools and other organizations make an effort to remember. I served in Nova Scotia when I was in the RCAF, Madam Speaker, and certainly I saw the large cenotaph gatherings in that province because of the holiday. So it really is a discretion of the provinces, Madam Speaker. Several members have mentioned that. But I'm going to bring a history of the day to our debate here today because I think that's important. I hope some Canadians want to see how our country has evolved our remembrance, especially in our 150th year, Madam Speaker. We really have to thank the people who served and sacrificed for us. In our 150 years, Madam Speaker, 1.5 million Canadians have served our country throughout our history. So debates about Remembrance Day or Armistice Day are important. I would also like to say that nobody has fought for this issue to come to debate in the House of Commons more than Wilma McNeil from Sarnia, Madam Speaker. I've met Ms. McNeil. I've seen her letters. I know her advocacy, so I thank her for that. She's been doing this for over 27 years, trying to have all provinces recognize it as a holiday, Madam Speaker, and I thank her for that advocacy. And I certainly agree that more Canadians need to remember. It's how we do that that's important. So it was this place, Madam Speaker, in 1919, following the Great War, following the rebirth of this Parliament when the buildings were reconstructed and our Peace Tower was a reminder of the sacrifice of the Great War. So a motion was brought by MP Isaac Pedlow in 1919 to recognize Armistice Day. The Great War ended at the 11th hour and the 11th day of the 11th month, and November 11th became significant for the peace that was finally secured after the terrible horrors of the Great War. But what was interesting, it was just a motion to acknowledge that, Madam Speaker, in 1919. And it was 2 years later that an act came before this House for the first time, the Armistice Day Act. It was still called Armistice Day at that time, Madam Speaker. And what was interesting was our country's early marking of this remembrance, Armistice Day, was not on November 11th for pretty much the first decade, Madam Speaker. It was on the first Monday of the week of November 11th. And because at that time Thanksgiving was at the discretion of federal Parliament, it was tied together in a holiday alongside Thanksgiving. But in the years that followed that, a lot of Great War veterans did not like the fact that those holidays, Thanksgiving and the remembrance of Armistice Day, were attached to one another, and there was a floating date. And increasingly, veterans, regardless of what day was recognized as the holiday, were gathering at cenotaphs across the country and gathering here in Parliament, and a decade later at the Great War Memorial that was built, to recognize November 11th and moments of silence on the 11th. So it's interesting that in the years after the Great War, all of these veterans organizations, Great War, Empire veterans, finally gathered together into one national organization, Madam Speaker, the Royal Canadian Legion, in 1925. And I know a lot of members of this House, on both sides of the House, are members of that very important service organization. And I thank all of the Legion members and the service officers for the critical work they do. I saw that firsthand, Madam Speaker, as Veterans Affairs Minister. They are the front lines serving our veterans, and they have been since 1925. At their founding convention in Winnipeg, Madam Speaker, the Great War veterans addressed the issue of remembrance, and they did not want the Monday observation of Armistice Day alongside Thanksgiving to be maintained. The Great War veterans spoke, and that led to change, Madam Speaker. I also want to use this opportunity to remind members of this House, remind the Minister of Veterans Affairs and his Parliamentary Secretary, and I know she's very passionate about her role. She has children serving in uniform. She's very proud of them and should be, Madam Speaker. At that founding convention, veterans put themselves together to help one another and to mark remembrance. And then the next year, this place, Parliament, passed another act in 1926, an act to incorporate the Royal Canadian Legion. And I'll refer members to Section 4, the purposes and objects of the Legion, which was an act of this Parliament. No other service club has its mandate from an act of Parliament, Madam Speaker. And at Section 4F, Remembrance Day and remembrance was actually given to the Legion, Madam Speaker. I'll quote Section 4F, to promote and care for memorials to their valor and sacrifice and to provide suitable burial, to keep an annual Memorial Day, Madam Speaker, end quote. There's a number of other purposes and objectives that I think Canadians, I think parliamentarians should get to know, because long before there was a Veterans Affairs Canada, Madam Speaker, there was the Royal Canadian Legion that was empowered by Parliament to help care for our veterans and help to preserve their service and sacrifice. So it was actually the Legion, Madam Speaker, that wanted November 11th to be held, not a floating holiday, but November 11th to be significant in the history of our nation, and to have the moment of silence surrounding the armistice at the 11th hour, Madam Speaker. And from that direction of the Great War veterans, the Royal Canadian Legion, there was finally another motion brought to this chamber by the MP for Comox Alberni. And the motion's intention was to fix November 11th as the permanent Armistice Day. The interesting part of that debate, Madam Speaker, is most members had heard the Legion loud and clear and said, November 11th it will be. But another Vancouver Island MP added to the debate and to the motion, Madam Speaker, the MP from Nanaimo, and said that the day should no longer be called Armistice Day because it's not just marking that armistice agreement. It should be marked as Remembrance Day. And the member, C.W. Dickey at the time, said, I quote, "We wish to remember and perpetuate," unquote, "the armistice and the peace secured at tremendous sacrifice to Canada," Madam Speaker. And what was interesting, in those same years, the formation of what we know now as Remembrance Day was just being formed by our country. The Peace Tower and the Book of Remembrance was being put in place above us, our most hallowed ground in this building, Madam Speaker. Each day a page is turned for the thousands of Canadians who fell in service of our country. And so the debate that comes here today is significant. And I think, as to echo my friend from Barrie, who quoted the executive director of the Royal Canadian Legion, I think we must respect the Legion's opinion with respect to Remembrance Day, Madam Speaker, because this Parliament, not this Parliament, but a previous Parliament, Madam Speaker, empowered the Royal Canadian Legion by an act in 1926 to maintain the memorial to our fallen. And the motion in 1931 created that on November 11th, called it Remembrance Day. And so I'm able to support this Bill C-311 here today, Madam Speaker, but we should adhere to what the Legion, the true safeguard, guardians of this day want with respect to how the provinces handle it. So I want to thank the member. I want to thank the Legion. I want to thank Wilma McNeil, Madam Speaker, and all those Canadians who make sure that we live up to the expression, lest we forget.